I was 26 when my parents stopped looking at me as their daughter and started treating me like their tenant. One summer night in Dallas, my father slid a white envelope across the table without even raising his eyes. Inside was an invoice. $2,800 typed with sterile precision. Rent, utilities, household costs. Every word cut like a blade, telling me I was nothing more than their paycheck. My mother called it responsibility. My father called it fairness, while my sister Emily twirled her hair and laughed at her phone screen, owing nothing, paying nothing. In that moment, the love I thought I had was replaced by a contract, and the home I had grown up in no longer felt like mine. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The table was already set. A pot of stew sat in the center, steam curling into the yellow light above. My mother, Patricia, moved with her usual precise motions, laying out forks and napkins, as if we were entertaining company. My father, Richard, sat stiffly at the head of the table, arms crossed, face unreadable. My younger sister, Emily, lounged in her chair, phone tilted toward her face, thumbs flying across the screen. Her laugh, high, careless, cut through the stillness. I slid into my seat, trying to ignore the ache in my calves. Before I could reach for water, my father pushed an envelope across the table. White, thick, sealed. He didn't look at me. "What's this?" I asked, though. Something in my chest tightened. "Read it," he said, his voice flat, as if he were reading from a utility bill. I tore the flap open with tired fingers. Inside was a typed sheet, margins perfectly aligned, no trace of handwriting. My name was printed in block letters at the top. Below it, a neat breakdown: rent $1,500, utilities $500, household contribution $800, total $2,800, due the first of every month, late fee $50. The room seemed to tilt. Emily's nails clicked against her phone screen. She didn't bother to look up. "Oh my God, that's hilarious!" She giggled to someone on TikTok, oblivious to the silence thickening around her. I looked back at the page. The words blurred, not because I couldn't read them, but because each line cut deeper than the last. Rent, utilities, household contribution, household but not home. Mom's voice broke the silence, smooth and practiced. "You've been stable for a while now, Rachel. 2 jobs, steady income. It's time you learned real responsibility. Stable." The word landed like a stone. Did they think stability meant dragging myself from a teller's window to a greasy apron 6 days a week just to keep my head above water? Did they think skipping meals and living in a childhood bedroom with peeling paint was stability? I pressed the paper flat against the table. So this starts when my voice came out thinner than I intended. "Next week," Dad said, already spearing a piece of carrot from his bowl. "We trust you can manage that." My mother added her fork, tapping the rim of her glass. "And just so we're clear, late payments come with a fee. That's how the real world works. The real world, as if I hadn't been living in it every second of the last 6 years. Emily twirled a strand of hair around her finger, her phone lighting her face. She smirked without looking at me. "Guess you're the grown-up now," she murmured. My throat tightened. I folded the invoice carefully, as if by making the creases neat, I could contain the rising heat in my chest. My hands shook anyway. I wanted to argue, to scream that this was insane, that Emily contributed nothing, and yet sat there in my hoodie, living off my credit card orders, her world as effortless as a filtered video. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I slipped the envelope into my purse. The stew on my plate cooled untouched. My father kept eating mechanical. My mother hummed softly as she wiped a non-existent spot from her glass. Emily's laughter burst out again, shrill and thoughtless, like none of this had anything to do with her. I sat there, spine stiff, heart pounding, swallowing down everything I wanted to say, because in that moment I understood something that lodged itself deep inside me. This wasn't just a bill. It was a line drawn, a warning, a declaration that whatever bond had existed between us was no longer enough. I pushed my chair back quietly, excused myself before the tremor in my voice betrayed me, and carried the weight of that envelope upstairs. The clink of silverware filled the silence I'd left behind, every scrape against the plates louder than it should have been. My father didn't look up from his bowl. He swallowed a mouthful of stew and cleared his throat. Starting next week, he said flatly, the money has to be in on time. No excuses. The words sat heavy in the air like a sentence already passed. Across from me, Emily leaned her elbow on the table, chin propped in her palm, her other hand still scrolling her phone. She flipped the camera to selfie mode and puckered her lips, applying another layer of gloss with practiced precision. She smirked at her reflection, then glanced my way, her eyes glittering with something between amusement and dismissal. My mother dabbed at her lips with a napkin and spoke with that syrupy tone she used whenever she wanted her words to sound like care instead of condemnation. Your sister is still finding her way, Rachel. She's young. She needs space to figure things out. You, on the other hand, are grown. You've been stable for years now. It's your responsibility to contribute. I let out a short laugh, more air than sound. Stable, I repeated under my breath. My hands tightened around my fork knuckles, pale. Emily giggled at something on her screen, tapping quickly, no doubt replying to one of her followers. She didn't even pretend to be part of the conversation. The glow of her phone lit up her face, soft and carefree, while mine felt drawn and shadowed under the weight of expectation. Emily is still just 23. Mom went on as if I hadn't spoken. You can't expect her to shoulder the same burdens you do. My father finally looked up, his eyes sharp and cold. We're not debating this. You'll pay your share. End of story. Heat surged through me, burning hotter than the stew cooling on my plate. Images flashed in my mind, memories sharp as glass. 12 years old folding laundry while Emily ran outside with a new doll. 15 bagging groceries on weekends to cover my own school supplies while Emily twirled in a new dress for Mom's praise. 17 pulling double shifts at the movie theater so I could buy my own laptop while Emily got hers as a Christmas gift wrapped in red ribbon. The pattern was clear. Always had been. I was the dependable one, the worker, the fixer. Emily was the darling shielded from consequences, fed excuses dressed up as love. And now all of it had calcified into numbers on a page. $2, $800 a month, stamped with my name, my so-called duty. I stared at the family I thought I belonged to. My mother's eyes shone with satisfaction at her own reasoning. My father's face was rigid, daring me to argue. Emily's laugh spilled out again, careless and grating, as if none of this had anything to do with her. My chest tightened. A thought came unbidden, bitter and cold. I wasn't their daughter at this table. I was their tenant, their provider, their safety net. My fork clattered against the plate. No one flinched. I sat back in my chair, scanning the faces around me. The family I'd broken myself for the family who saw me not as blood but as a paycheck. In that moment, I knew something had shifted. I wasn't just eating stew in a quiet Dallas dining room. I was watching the last threads of belonging snap one by one. And what stared back at me from across that table wasn't love. It was entitlement, plain and merciless. The next morning, I slipped into the navy blazer that had started to lose its shape from too many dry cleaning cycles. The sun poured through the tall windows of Lone Star Credit Union, catching on the glass walls and polished counters. I pasted on the professional smile I'd practiced for years, though inside my chest felt hollow. Customers shuffled in, some with polite nods, others snapping their fingers impatiently. A man argued with me for 20 minutes over a bounced check, his voice rising loud enough for the manager to glance over, but no one stepped in. By noon, my temples pounded. My jaw clenched from keeping my tone even. When 4 o'clock finally hit, I gathered my things and practically jogged to the parking lot, swapping my blazer for a worn black t-shirt that smelled faintly of bleach. My second shift waited across town at a Tex-Mex place that never seemed to quiet down. The moment I tied the apron around my waist, the kitchen bell was already ringing. I carried trays heavy with sizzling fajitas, weaving through crowded tables while children cried and couples argued. The soles of my shoes stuck slightly to the floor, and every time I turned my ankle throbbed. By 10 p.m., I had sweat dripping down my back and a smile frozen onto my face as I refilled yet another basket of chips. Dinner for me was a paper cup of coffee and the corner of a day-old muffin I'd grabbed between jobs. My stomach cramped, but I ignored it. I'd learned to. Close to midnight, I dragged myself home, my legs numb from standing. I opened the front door to the sound of canned laughter echoing from the living room. There was Emily stretched across the couch like a queen in her throne, wrapped in the gray hoodie I'd bought with my first paycheck at 18. She'd claimed it years ago and never given it back. Her phone glowed on the coffee table beside a brand new Amazon package with my name printed on the label. I froze, keys still in my hand. "Emily," I said slowly, picking up the box. "Did you use my card again?" She didn't look guilty. She didn't even flinch. She reached for the remote, flipping to the next episode of her show. "Relax. You said I could once remember for textbooks. You never changed the login." "That was 3 years ago," I snapped, voice shaking from exhaustion more than anger. "And that was for school, not—" "Whatever this is." I shook the package. It rattled with the weight of something expensive. Emily rolled her eyes. "You're so dramatic. It's just a moisturizer kit. Don't act like you can't afford it. You've got steady income. 2 jobs, right?" The words stabbed deep, the same echo of what my parents always said. I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek. My mother appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel as if she had been waiting for this. "What's going on now?" "She's still using my credit card," I said, my voice lower now, tight. "These charges." Mom sighed, a long exhale full of disappointment aimed at me, not at Emily. "Rachel, your sister is trying to find her path. You know she's not as grounded as you. Why not support each other instead of keeping score?" I stared at her, my jaw slack. Support each other. Was I not already carrying them all? My back ached from hours of labor, my bank account bleeding out, and yet I was the one scolded for daring to notice. Emily smirked from the couch, eyes flicking between us like she'd already won. My throat tightened. "You don't see it as theft," I whispered more to myself than to them. "You see it as natural. I earn. She consumes. And you call that balance?" Neither of them answered. The sitcom laugh track filled the silence, mocking me. I carried the package upstairs, my hand trembling on the banister. In my room, I dropped it onto the desk and sat heavily on the edge of the bed. My shoes were still on dirt, clinging to the soles, but I didn't care. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the banking app. Line after line of charges appeared. Cosmetics, streaming, subscriptions, meal kits. Not mine. All linked to the card connected to our family Wi-Fi account. My pulse thudded in my ears. I opened a new spreadsheet on my laptop. At the top, I typed expenses they don't pay. Below it, I created columns: rent, utilities, groceries, unauthorized charges. My fingers shook, but with every entry I felt a strange clarity. Row by row, I added the evidence: green for what I'd paid, red for what Emily had stolen, yellow for what still hung unresolved. The exhaustion pressing on my body didn't vanish, but it shifted. No longer just fatigue. It was fuel. Downstairs, I could hear Emily's laughter again, carefree and sharp. My mother's murmur followed a gentle tone she'd never used on me. I stared at the glowing spreadsheet until the numbers blurred. My wrists ached, my head swam, but I kept typing. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't just enduring. I was recording. I was building a ledger proof of what they'd done to me. And sitting there in the dim light of my childhood room, I realized something else. They weren't just draining my paycheck. They were draining me, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, until there would be nothing left. I wouldn't let them finish the job. By Friday afternoon, the lobby at Lone Star Credit Union smelled faintly of copier ink and stale coffee. I sat behind my teller window, sliding stacks of bills into the counter, my hands moving on autopilot. while my mind drifted to the spreadsheet hidden on my laptop at home. My eyelids felt heavy, the numbers swimming together. "Rachel," a voice cut in. I looked up to see Ezra leaning against the divider, his tie loose, that lopsided grin he wore like armor tugging at his mouth. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." "Try a month," I muttered, keeping my voice low so the customers in line couldn't hear. He studied me for a moment, then crooked his finger, motioning me toward the back hallway. Got a second, I glanced at the line. No one was in a hurry. And nodded. I slipped out from behind the counter and followed him down the hall lined with framed certificates and faded posters about retirement accounts. He stopped at a computer station reserved for staff, tapped in a password, and pulled up a public mortgage registry. "What are you doing?" I asked, my stomach already tight. Ezra scrolled, eyes narrowing. "I thought you should see this. Your parents' place on Timberline Drive." He clicked and a document opened on the screen. "They refinanced in 2022. Payments are delinquent. 120 days past due." For a second, the words didn't register. The fluorescent lights above buzzed, my pulse drowned everything else out. "That's not possible," I said, though my voice cracked. "I've been paying every month on time. Rent, utilities, contributions, thousands of dollars." Ezra's gaze softened, but his tone stayed blunt. "Rachel, they're not teaching you responsibility. They're keeping the lights on with your paycheck. You're not a tenant. You're a stopgap." The air rushed out of me. My knees threatened to buckle, so I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles whitened. Images crashed through my mind. My father sliding that envelope across the table, my mother's rehearsed lecture about adulthood, Emily smirking from the couch while wearing my hoodie. And behind it all, this truth: every dollar I bled for them hadn't been about raising me up. It had been about keeping them afloat, hiding the cracks. I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to steady the hammering inside. So the whole time, it wasn't about me at all. Ezra didn't answer right away. He just let me really look at the screen, at the black and white proof of how deep their lies went. Finally, he said softer, "I'm sorry. I know it hurts, but maybe it's the push you needed." I wanted to argue to defend them out of habit, but the words died in my throat. Because for the first time I couldn't find an excuse. Not for them. Not for the way they'd dressed betrayal up as tough love. The floor felt unsteady under my heels, like the building itself was tilting. I straightened slowly, swallowing the acid burn climbing my throat. My reflection in the dark computer screen looked older, harder, a stranger with my face. "They've been using me," I whispered the syllables, tasting bitter. Ezra didn't deny it. He just placed a hand on the desk between us, steady and solid, a silent anchor. I turned away before he could see my eyes fill. The hallway swam in front of me, but with every step back toward my station, something inside me shifted. I'd thought exhaustion was my normal sacrifice, my role. But now I knew better. This wasn't family. It was dependence. It was exploitation. By the time I slid back behind my window and greeted the next customer with a rehearsed smile, a spark had lit in my chest. Small, fragile, but unmistakable. I might have been silent at that dinner table. I might have folded the envelope and slipped it into my purse without a word, but I wasn't going to let them hold the pen anymore. Back in my room, I shut the door and leaned against it, letting the silence wrap around me. My pulse was still racing from what Ezra had shown me. I kicked off my shoes, dropped my bag on the floor, and pulled my laptop onto my lap. The glow of the screen painted the walls of my childhood room. Those same faded posters from high school, staring back like ghosts of the girl I used to be. I opened a folder I hadn't touched in months, labeled simply Savings. Inside were spreadsheets going back 4 years, each row a quiet act of rebellion. Every overtime hour, every holiday shift no one else wanted, every quarterly bonus from the bank. It was all here. I scrolled slowly, my eyes tracing the green highlighted entries. There were notes about freelance reports I'd written late at night, the modest checks from proofing small business proposals, the extra cash from covering coworkers' shifts when they called in sick. It wasn't glamorous money, but it was mine. The total at the bottom glowed back at me, $179,842 under 13. I exhaled a sound caught somewhere between disbelief and relief. For years I'd convinced myself this was just survival money, a cushion in case of emergencies. But looking at it now, I realized it was more than that. It was proof that even as they drained me, I'd carved out a secret corner for myself. A life raft they didn't know existed. I clicked open a second browser window and pulled up Lone Star Federal Credit Union's site, then hesitated. Too visible. If I opened an account here, my parents could catch wind through their connections in town. Instead, I typed in the name of a smaller credit union across the city, one I knew didn't send paper statements unless requested. 15 minutes later, I had a new account set up, routed to a P.O. box I'd quietly registered last year when I'd first started feeling the walls closing in. I transferred half my savings immediately, watching the numbers shift. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from something sharper. Power. I sat back, the cheap desk chair creaking under me, and for the first time in a long time I felt like I wasn't drowning. Ezra's words from earlier echoed in my mind. Maybe it's the push you needed. He didn't know how right he was. I leaned over, opened the drawer of my nightstand, and pulled out a stack of envelopes I'd kept over the years. Old pay stubs, clipped coupons, receipts from clearance racks at Target. I remembered the sting of saying no to dinners out with friends, of skipping vacations, of telling Emily I couldn't loan her cash for yet another makeup haul. Every sacrifice sat in these stacks, and now I saw them for what they were, bricks in a foundation I'd built alone. I spread them across my bed, the paper rustling under my fingers. Each one told a story of me scraping by, of me cutting corners. And together they told me something else: I wasn't powerless. I'd been building leverage without even knowing it. I thought about my parents downstairs laughing with Emily as if nothing were wrong, as if they hadn't just shoved me into the role of their landlord in all but name. They believed I had no choice but to comply. They believed I was theirs to drain. But they didn't know about this. They didn't know I had a secret account, a secret reserve, a secret plan forming in the quiet spaces of my exhaustion. I closed the laptop, gently slid the envelopes back into the drawer, and locked it. My reflection in the window caught my eye. I looked tired, yes, but there was something else now. A glint that hadn't been there before. I brushed my hair back, smoothed the wrinkles out of my shirt, and whispered to myself, "They think they own me, but this is mine." The words settled into the room like a promise. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like their victim. I felt like someone holding a secret weapon. And though the weight of the day still pressed against my shoulders, beneath it all was a current of something fierce and unstoppable, a current that whispered, "It's only the beginning." Sunday morning sunlight spilled through the stained glass windows, casting fractured colors across the rows of pews. I sat stiffly beside my mother, the hymnal heavy in my lap. Her voice blended with the congregation as we sang, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd dragged me here with a purpose. When Pastor John rose to deliver his sermon, his words came slow and deliberate. He spoke about honoring parents, about the sacred duty of children to care for those who raised them. "It's not always easy," he said, his gaze sweeping over the room. "But it's what God commands. Sacrifice is the truest expression of love." His eyes lingered on me for a moment too long, and I felt every neck in the pews shift slightly in my direction. The air in my chest went tight. My hands curled around the edges of the hymnal until the paper bent. I could almost hear my mother's thoughts. "See, even the pastor agrees." After the service, people gathered in the fellowship hall, sipping weak coffee and eating cookies from plastic trays. I stayed near the back, hoping to slip out unnoticed, but whispers seemed to chase me. Aunt Deborah's voice cut through, soft but sharp, as she leaned toward another churchgoer. "Rachel's gotten so cold, hasn't she? Only cares about money. Poor Patricia, imagine having a daughter like that." I froze mid-step, my cheeks burning. A couple of older women nodded sympathetically at her, their eyes flicking toward me before darting away. Then I heard my name again from across the room. "Emily is such a sweet girl," someone said brightly. "Always so polite, so lovely to be around." I turned to see Emily basking in the attention of a group near the refreshment table. her dress soft pink, her smile practiced and angelic. She laughed lightly, tucking her hair behind her ear like a movie star. Patricia stood beside her, beaming her hand resting proudly on her younger daughter's arm. My throat tightened. I wanted to shout, to tell them about the bills, the credit card charges, the envelope still burning a hole in my purse, but I stayed silent, the words catching like stones in my throat. A woman from the choir approached me with a strained smile. "Rachel, you should be grateful for what you have. Not everyone is blessed with such a strong family. Don't let work harden your heart." My mouth opened, then closed. What would be the point? They didn't want the truth. They wanted a story that made sense to them. Dutiful daughter turns cold, sweet sister shines. Walls of the fellowship hall seemed to close in the smell of brewed coffee, suddenly suffocating. I slipped outside into the humid Texas air, my heels clicking against the pavement as I made for the car. The sky was too blue, the sun too bright, mocking the storm inside me. I leaned against the driver's side door and forced a breath. The voices still rang in my ears. Selfish, cold, ungrateful. Emily, sweet Rachel, difficult. My mother's words at the dinner table replayed over and over now, reinforced by the pastor's sermon. Aunt Deborah's whispers, the approving nods of neighbors. It wasn't just my parents anymore. It was the whole community wrapping their judgment around me like chains. I stared down at my trembling hands and made a vow, silent but searing. If they wanted to paint me as cold, I would let them. If they wanted to call me ungrateful, I would wear it. Because the truth was mine to prove, not theirs to define. I straightened, wiped the sweat from my palms, and slid into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and as I pulled away from the church lot, a fierce heat burned low in my chest. They thought they had me cornered, backed into silence by shame and expectation. But all they'd really done was light a fire. My phone buzzed late on a Tuesday afternoon as I sat parked outside the diner trying to muster the energy for another night of endless refills and heavy trays. The name flashing on the screen made me sit up straighter. Linda Vega. "Rachel," she said when I answered, her voice steady and low. "I think I've found something that fits what you told me." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "What is it?" "There's a 2-story over in Fort Worth," she explained. 3 bedrooms, decent neighborhood, decent schools, small backyard. The owner's in the middle of a bankruptcy. They're asking $310. Way under market if you know the comps. I stared through the windshield at the neon glow of the diner sign. $310. My secret account held just under $180. My throat went dry. "I don't have that kind of cash." I admitted, the words catching. "You're closer than you think," Linda said. "And if you can move fast, you'll have leverage." That night, I drove straight to Ezra's apartment after my shift, still in my apron hair pulled back with grease clinging to the strands. He opened the door, one eyebrow arched at my expression. "What happened?" he asked. I sank into his couch and told him everything. Linda's call, the numbers, my savings. He listened quietly, then leaned forward. "You're only short by what, 130? I nodded. He smirked, that lazy grin of his flashing for a second. "I can cover that. Loan, no interest, no timeline. You've carried enough on your back, Rach." The lump in my throat made it hard to breathe. "I can't let you. You can—" He cut me off. "And you should. You deserve a clean exit." The following morning, I met Linda at a small cafe off Henderson Street. She was already waiting with a folder, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. She slid the papers across to me. "Floor plans, tax records, comparable sales." "It's clean," she said. "No liens outside the bankruptcy. But if you want to keep your parents in the dark, we can't buy it in your name." I frowned. "So what's the alternative?" "We set up an LLC. Standard shell. You'll be the sole member, but the deed lists the company. Keeps your name out of the county records. I've got a lawyer I trust. Mark Johnson. He'll handle the filings." The words tumbled around in my head. An LLC. Me owning property through a company. It sounded foreign, impossible. But then I thought of my parents' mortgage delinquency of the envelope slid across the dinner table of the whispers at church. My chest tightened with something I hadn't felt in years possibility. "Do it," I said before I could second-guess myself. Linda's lips curved in the smallest smile. Ironclad Properties, though. That's the name I've penciled in. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Ironclad, I repeated. The word tasted solid, final, unbreakable. Exactly what I needed to be. 2 days later, I sat in a tidy downtown office, the smell of leather and old books heavy in the air. Mark Johnson shook my hand firmly, his suit pressed sharp. "I understand you want to move fast," he said, scanning the papers. "Cash deals are simple if you have the funds. We'll form the LLC Today file with the state, and by next week Ironclad Properties can be the listed buyer. Sellers in bankruptcy court don't argue with cash." My fingers brushed the edge of the cashier's check in my purse. Every dollar I had scraped together plus Ezra's loan sat in that envelope. My heart thundered with the weight of it. Mark leaned back, pen tapping against his legal pad. "I've seen situations like this, Rachel. People underestimate what control can look like when you stop letting others dictate the terms." Then I swallowed hard. "They've dictated everything for as long as I can remember. Then let this be the last time." When I walked out of his office, the autumn sun hit me full in the face. I felt taller, steadier, like the ground beneath me had shifted in my favor. For once, I wasn't reacting. I was acting. That night, as I folded my diner uniform into the laundry, I caught my reflection in the cracked mirror above my dresser. The tired lines under my eyes were still there, the calluses on my hands hadn't softened. But behind all of it, there was something new control. For years, I had been their safety net. Now, for the first time, I held the scissors, and I knew exactly where I would cut. The morning sun slanted through the kitchen blinds, striping the table in pale light. My father was already seated, a manila envelope at his side. He didn't bother with small talk, didn't even look at me as I poured a glass of water. He slid the paper across the table with the same motion as before, the same cold efficiency. "Rent's due, Rachel. First payment. Don't be late." I pulled out a chair, sat down slowly, and let the silence stretch. My hand rested on the envelope, but I didn't open it. I met his eyes instead. "You'll get a notice soon," I said evenly. He frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You'll see." My voice didn't waver, though my heart hammered. My mother glanced up from the sink, confusion flickering in her face. Emily, perched on a stool, scrolling through her phone, snorted. "What, you win the lottery or something?" I stood, slipping the envelope into my bag without another word. The quiet confidence in my chest held me upright, carried me out the door before they could press me further. By afternoon, the house on Timberline Drive was buzzing for all the wrong reasons. I wasn't there to see it firsthand, but Linda called me after dropping the documents into the mailbox. "It's done," she said simply. "They'll have the letter by now. Ironclad Properties is the owner of record. Deed transferred. You're official," I thanked her. My voice unsteady, and ended the call. Then I waited. It didn't take long. My phone lit up with message after message. Missed calls, texts from my mother. I ignored them all, pacing the floor of my apartment, every nerve alive. Across town, Patricia stood on the porch, holding the notice in her hands, her face pale as the paper itself. Richard snatched it from her, reading and rereading the lines, his jaw clenching so tight it looked painful. Emily leaned over his shoulder, her mouth falling open. "What the hell is Ironclad Properties?" "Some mistake," Richard muttered, though his eyes betrayed him. He could see it in the language, in the signatures, in the seal at the bottom of the page. This was no scam. It was final. Neighbors mowing lawns slowed, curious glances darting toward the scene. One woman whispered across the fence to another, both sets of eyes fixed on my mother's trembling hands. The letter shook the words, "Property transferred clear," for anyone close enough to glimpse. By evening, word had reached further. Patricia's church friends called to ask if everything was all right. Someone had already repeated it during a prayer circle. Did you hear? Their house isn't theirs anymore. Their daughter's company bought it. I pictured them inside that house, blinds drawn, tension crawling along the walls like smoke. My father pacing, muttering, slamming a hand against the counter. My mother wringing her hands, her phone buzzing non-stop with whispers disguised as concern. Emily pacing in disbelief, insisting it couldn't be true. But it was. And for once the weight pressing down wasn't on me, it was on them. I sat by the window of my apartment watching the last of the daylight fade over Dallas, the air heavy with late summer heat. My phone buzzed again. Dad this time. I let it ring, each vibration a reminder of the shift that had finally taken place. The power they'd held, the grip that had suffocated me for years, was slipping through their fingers. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small under their gaze. I felt steady, unmovable, ironclad. The knock came just after 9. 3 sharp raps, the kind meant to demand rather than request. I'd been expecting it all day. I opened the door to find my parents on the landing, both drawn tight as bowstrings. My father's polo shirt was tucked too neatly, his jaw locked. My mother clutched her purse against her chest like a shield. And behind them, Emily hovered with her arms crossed, chin lifted. Sunglasses still perched on her head, though the sun had set hours ago. Rachel, my mother began, voice pitched high, too sweet. We need to talk. I stepped aside just enough for them to file in, then closed the door. Mom. The small apartment felt even smaller with their presence, the air thick with their disapproval. Sit, I said. They took the couch. Emily flopped down dramatically, stretching her legs, while my father perched stiffly on the edge, hands braced on his knees. My mother smoothed her skirt over and over her eyes, darting around the room as if cataloging the modest furniture and bare walls. I didn't join them. Instead, I carried a thick manila folder to the table and began laying out papers one by one. Receipts, rent invoices, utility bills, bank statements, a spreadsheet printout color-coded in sharp greens, yellows, and reds. At the very top, charges from my credit card with Emily's name attached. Sephora, Hulu, Uber Eats. I didn't say anything at first. I just let the sound of paper sliding against paper fill the silence. What is this? Richard snapped, his voice low and warning. The record, I said simply. Every dollar I've paid, every bill, every unauthorized charge. I kept it all. Patricia reached for one of the statements, her fingers trembling. She scanned the numbers, her mouth parting. Rachel, this isn't exaggerated, I cut in. No, it's exact. Down to the cent. Emily leaned forward, eyes darting over the highlighted lines. Her face drained of color when she saw her own name in black and white. This doesn't prove anything, she said quickly, her voice higher now. So what if I borrowed a little family's share? I said once, years ago. And you turned it into open season. My words were sharp but steady. Richard slammed a hand against the table, rattling the papers. Enough. We came here to sort this out, not be lectured. I met his glare head on. Then let's sort it out. I pulled one final document from the folder and slid it across. The property deed, ironclad properties stamped clear at the top. Patricia gasped softly, covering her mouth. Richard froze, scanning the page, then scanning it again. His face reddened, the veins in his neck standing out. Emily leaned over his shoulder, her lips parting. This isn't real, she whispered. It's very real, I said. Ironclad Properties owns Timberline Drive now, which means if you want to keep living there, you'll pay. My mother's voice cracked. Rachel, please. $2,800 a month. I continued, my tone cold. Do the first. Late fees apply. Emily shot to her feet, her face twisted with outrage. You're unbelievable. You'd really kick your own family out. You're heartless. I didn't flinch. Heartless. No, just consistent. I'm giving you the exact same terms you gave me. The room went dead quiet. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed louder than their silence. My father's breathing was heavy, shallow, like he was holding back a torrent of words he couldn't find. My mother's eyes glistened, but she didn't speak. Emily trembled, fists clenched at her sides. I gathered the papers, slowly stacking them with deliberate care. My hands didn't shake. Not anymore. Those are the terms, I said. If you want to stay, you pay. If not, you find somewhere else. Either way, it's not my problem anymore. The three of them sat frozen, caught between anger, shame, and disbelief. For once, I wasn't the one shrinking under their gaze. I was the one holding it steady, unblinking. In that silence, in that stillness, the balance shifted completely. For years, I had been their safety net. Tonight, I was their landlord. The power they'd clung to slipped, and they knew it. 2 weeks later, my phone buzzed with a notification I hadn't expected. Emily live on Instagram. Against my better judgment, I tapped. She sat behind a desk at a strip mall salon in Arlington, a headset crooked against her glossy hair. The backdrop was a clutter of nail polish displays and posters advertising discounted highlights. She pouted into the camera, sighing dramatically. "This is so beneath me," she whined to the handful of viewers who had tuned in. Answering phones, booking appointments, dealing with rude customers. "It's humiliating." The comments scrolled fast. Mocking, laughing, a few blunt truths. "Should have thought about that before living off your sister," one wrote. "Get used to real life," another added. Emily's eyes flickered as she read her smile faltering, but she pressed on, trying to paint herself as the victim. I closed the app, shaking my head. News traveled fast in Dallas, and by Sunday the whispers had reached Timberline Drive. My parents still showed up at church, dressed in their Sunday best, holding their heads high, but the weight of knowledge pressed down on them, visible in the tightness of their smiles. "They're renting now," someone murmured near the pews. "From Rachel, can you believe it?" Another voice added. I caught sight of my mother. Her hands folded neatly in her lap, knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the hymnal. My father stood stiffer than usual, his jaw locked, daring anyone to comment. Pastor John's sermon danced carefully around the subject, skirting any mention of family duty or filial piety. For the first time, the arrows of guilt weren't aimed at me. They circled them instead. After the service, Aunt Deborah avoided my eyes completely. The same woman who once whispered about me being selfish now stood at the refreshment table, fumbling with a styrofoam cup of coffee, her mouth tight. She offered a strained smile, but said nothing. Silence was her surrender. Meanwhile, I was busy packing. The key to the Fort Worth house felt heavy but right in my palm. The first afternoon I walked through it alone, the echo of my footsteps followed me down the hallway. The walls were bare, the air faintly musty, but sunlight streamed through the front windows like a blessing. Room by room, I carried in the essentials. A mattress on the floor at first, then a second-hand sofa I'd bought with cash. But it was the extra bedroom upstairs that mattered most. I set it up carefully, a sturdy wooden easel in the corner, jars of brushes lined along the windowsill, a rug to soften the creak of the floorboards. The space smelled faintly of dust and potential. The first morning I opened the blinds and let the Texas sun pour in. Golden light spread across the blank canvas, waiting on the easel. I stood there barefoot, breathing it in, the quiet surrounding me like a cocoon. No shouting downstairs, no footsteps pacing the hall, no TV laugh tracks bleeding through the walls. Just stillness. I dipped my hand into the box of supplies I'd lugged from my closet back in Dallas. Tubes of paint, long unopened brushes stiff with neglect. My fingers trembled as I sorted them, but it wasn't exhaustion this time. It was anticipation. When I finally lowered myself into the chair, I didn't reach for the brush right away. Instead, I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the silence wrap me whole. My chest expanded deep and unhurried, as if for the first time in years I could breathe without something pressing down. I got up, crossed the room, and shut the door firmly behind me. The click of the latch echoed like a promise. For the first time, the space was mine. Entirely unapologetically mine. And as I stood in that light-drenched studio, inhaling the scent of old wood and new beginnings, I knew what freedom felt like. The box had been shoved to the back of my closet for years, its cardboard edges softened with time. I dragged it out onto the studio floor, dust rising as I peeled the flaps open. Inside lay the remnants of a life I had once believed belonged to me. Tubes of paint, half-dried a sketchbook with brittle pages, brushes worn but still waiting. My fingers lingered on one brush, the handle smooth where my grip had lived for so long. A wave of memory crashed through me. A college auditorium filled with easels, the smell of turpentine my name called when they handed me the ribbon for first place. I had stood tall then, smiling so wide my cheeks hurt, believing that art could carry me into the future. I dipped the brush into fresh paint, streaking color across canvas for the first time in years. The motion was shaky at first, the bristles catching awkwardly, but soon the lines flowed easier. Orange bled into deep blue shapes forming without plan, only instinct. Each stroke loosened something tight in my chest. The doorbell rang just as I wiped my hands on a rag. I opened it to find Naomi Carter holding 2 takeout bags. Her grin as bright as always. "I figured you'd forget to eat," she said, brushing past me. She spread the cartons across my small dining table, the scent of sesame and soy filling the room. As we ate, she noticed the streaks of paint on my arms. "You've been working," she said softly, a hint of excitement in her voice. I started again. I admitted, "It feels different this time. Like breathing after being underwater." Naomi set down her chopsticks. "Then you need to show people. Don't hide this. Think small. An open studio, a local gallery. Let the world see what you've kept locked away." I laughed, shaking my head. "I'm not ready for all that." "You are," she pressed, "and I'll help you plan it." Her confidence settled into me like warmth, a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone anymore. Later that week, Ezra stopped by after work, dropping onto the couch with his usual easy grin. He tossed a folded report onto the table. "Ironclad Properties," he announced, "is officially profitable. Your parents pay on time every month. They're desperate to keep up appearances." I opened the report, scanning the neat columns of figures. Rent received, expenses covered, surplus in black ink. For so long I had lived in red, drowning in numbers I couldn't catch up to. Now the balance leaned my way. "You're saying I'm a landlord with cash flow?" I asked, half incredulous. Ezra chuckled. "Exactly. And you did it without selling your soul." That night, as I cleaned the brushes in the sink, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. A picture loaded slowly, me at 21 standing in front of a large painting ribbon pinned to the canvas. My smile unguarded and certain. Beneath it, only 2 words. "I'm sorry." It was from my mother. I sat on the floor back against the cabinets, staring at the image until my eyes blurred. The girl in the photo looked like a stranger. Hopeful, open, untouched by bitterness. For a moment, grief and anger tangled inside me, then gave way to something quieter. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement. She remembered too. Days later, I carried a finished canvas downtown to a local coffee shop that displayed art from neighborhood painters. The owner, a kind-eyed man in his 40s, studied the piece with his arms folded. How much, he asked. My throat went dry. "It's not for sale," I started, but he cut me off. "I'll give you $400. Cash." The number wasn't life-changing, but my chest swelled as I nodded. When he pressed the bills into my hand, I felt something shift. This wasn't charity. This was value. Walking back to my car, the painting now hanging in the cafe window behind me, I realized revenge had carried me this far, but it wasn't the end of the story. The real victory was this: reclaiming the parts of myself I thought were gone forever. That night in my studio, I laid out fresh canvases, brushes lined in a row, paint tubes uncapped. I stood in the glow of the setting sun, colors spilling across the walls, and understood at last survival had given me freedom, but creation would give me life again. Morning light poured through the wide windows of my Fort Worth studio, streaking across the canvases lined against the walls. The air smelled faintly of turpentine and fresh paint, but underneath it was something calmer, steadier. like peace settling into my bones. I sipped my coffee slowly, then opened my laptop on the work table. My inbox glowed with messages I didn't need to read. I composed one of my own instead. Short and professional payment for this month is overdue. Late fees apply. I typed the ironclad properties signature at the bottom, clicked send, and shut the computer without a second thought. Almost immediately my phone buzzed. Emily's name flashed on the screen with a message. "Please, can you just help me this?" Once I stared at it for a long moment, thumb hovering. Then I pressed delete. No reply. No explanation. The silence that followed felt cleaner than any argument could. Later that afternoon, Naomi arrived with grocery bags, clinking bottles of sparkling cider and takeout containers stacked high. She breezed in, setting everything down on the counter. "Celebration dinner," she announced, already pulling out plates. Ezra showed up not long after loosening his tie, carrying a small bouquet of sunflowers he'd picked up at a corner stand. We ate at my kitchen table, laughter spilling easily between us. Naomi teased me about paint smudges on my cheek. Ezra waved the quarterly report from Ironclad like a victory flag. "Look at you," he said, raising his glass landlord-artist survivor. "All in one." I laughed, real and unforced. The sound surprised me. For so long, laughter had felt like something stolen, a rare luxury. Now it came without effort, filling the space with warmth. After dinner, we carried our glasses into the studio. The walls were alive with color. Canvases, big and small. Some finished, others still waiting. The three of us stood among them, the late sun flooding the room in amber. Ezra lifted his glass. Naomi joined him. I raised mine last. "To bad beginnings," Ezra said. "And better endings," Naomi added. We clinked the sound sharp and clear. I turned slowly, taking in the studio, the house, the faces of the only people who had stood by me without question. My chest swelled with something deeper than triumph. It wasn't just victory. It was reclamation. As the evening quieted, I stood near the easel, fingertips brushing the edge of a fresh canvas. My voice slipped out low but certain, carrying the weight of everything I had endured. They taught me to keep receipts, to pay bills, to measure life in invoices and penalties. They thought they were teaching me responsibility. What they were really teaching me was how to document, how to endure, how to build something stronger. I just took it one step further. Now the house is mine, the freedom is mine, and the silence, the finally, is mine too. I glanced at Naomi and Ezra, both watching me with quiet pride. The hum of the city beyond the window barely reached us. Inside these walls there was only stillness and the smell of paint drying. I picked up a brush, dipped it into a streak of crimson, and pressed it to the canvas. The color bloomed bold and unapologetic. My hand didn't tremble. For the first time, I wasn't painting to escape. I was painting because I could. And if you've ever been used, dismissed, or taken for granted by the very people who should have cherished you, you know what it feels like to fight for air. Share your story. Let it out. You're not alone here. This space, these voices, we carry each other. Stay. Tell me where you've been, and together we'll prove that even the deepest betrayals can be turned into something unshakable.